The Witcher versus Game of Thrones. Let's get right into it. First, it's important to discuss a few things about the authors of Game of Thrones and The Witcher, both George R. R. Martin and Andrzej Sapkowski respectively. So let's start with Martin. He grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey. He had a tough childhood where he was often bullied and excluded. He found escape using his imagination and in stories, as many of us have. He would write dramatic stories to his friends about kingdoms, sinister plots, and many of the themes you see him write about today. He became an avid comic book reader when Marvel Comics began and has said that Stan Lee may have been more influential to him than Tolkien and Shakespeare. He is also a huge opponent of war, which is of particular interest given his often war-filled dramatic stories. During the Vietnam War, Martin applied for and obtained conscientious objector status, exemplifying and embodying his view of war. He began to write short stories and science fiction and became reputable enough to start writing screenplays for movies and TV shows. He wrote vampire novels, mixed science fiction and horror, and always added his unique flair to his stories. He also famously wrote several episodes of the original Twilight Zone. Though he was a great screenplay writer, Martin was disappointed by production limits and episode lengths and being forced to cut characters in the TV industry. This reoriented his focus toward books, where his imagination was limitless and there was no budget. And so in 1991 began writing A Song of Ice and Fire, inspired by the works of Tolkien, English history, Norse mythology, and many others. Andrzej Sapkowski was born in Lodz, Poland in 1948, and his early life differs pretty significantly from Martin's. He studied economics at the University of Lodz and worked as a sales representative and businessman before writing The Witcher in 1990. Sapkowski has stated that he wrote The Witcher for his son, who was a huge fan of the Polish Fantaskia magazine. He published the story in the magazine in 1986, which became enormously successful. In 1990, he finished and published a collection of 5 short stories titled The Witcher, which lately became integrated into The Last Wish, which was republished in 1993. Sapkowski takes a lot of his inspiration from Ernest Hemingway, an American literary writer of the 20th century whose writing often contended with the themes of love, war, nature, rebirth, and transcendence. Similarly, he takes a lot of inspiration from Mikhail Bulgakov, who famously wrote The Master and the Margarita, Umberto Eco, and many others. The authors are very similar in a few ways which I'll lay out. They were both born in the same year, 1948. Similarly, they both take their inspiration from depictions of high and low fantasy. What are these, you might ask? Well, high fantasy refers to stories set in an imaginary world, with more idealistic and epic themes and the frequent use of magic, spells, etc., whereas low fantasy refers to ones with minimal supernaturalism, magic, etc., and take place in a world that is very relatable and easy to picture yourself in. So, Lord of the Rings, for example, is very high fantasy. We can make easy distinctions between good and evil. Characters like Aragorn and Gandalf are near-perfect heroes, contending with the will of Sauron, who is obviously evil, if you couldn't tell by his employees. In contrast, Game of Thrones and The Witcher both take place in very low fantasy settings. There is a palpable medieval feeling to both series, and a very clear departure from Tolkien's world where good and evil are easily distinguishable. One of Martin's most famous quotes about his writing is, "The only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself." And that's the most important and crucial aspect in his writing, as the themes of politics, betrayal, sacrifice, love versus duty, and moral ambiguity are plainly abundant. These themes are also evident throughout Sapkowski's work. Though the two both incorporate elements of high fantasy, such as Martin's inclusion of dragons and sorceresses and Sapkowski's inclusion of magic and monsters, the world the characters inhabit is more medieval, ambiguous, and ultimately realistic. So when we break down some of the themes from the books and the movies, there's definitely going to be some spoilers ahead. So let's look at an example of these themes in Martin. In Game of Thrones, we meet the character of Robb Stark early on. He's good-looking, charismatic, a good commander, and he looks great in that coat. And he's nice to Jon, who we feel bad for in the beginning of the series. But his downfall, and the downfall of House Stark, with the exception of Sansa later in the series, is predicated upon his political incompetence. He, as well as Catelyn, commit a series of political blunders that lead to their ultimate downfall. For example, he agrees to marry the daughter of Walder Frey, but breaks that promise in favor of another woman. Later, Catelyn releases Jaime in hopes that she can see her daughter again, trusting the word of Jaime Lannister, which seems very unwise at this point in the story. Later, Robb executes the leader of House Karstark, a cadet branch of the Stark house, for killing the nephews of Tywin Lannister, the clear enemy of the Starks. All of these events come back to haunt Robb and Catelyn in larger and larger ways, culminating in the Red Wedding. The point here is, we as an audience love Robb Stark. He's our hero, the new protagonist after Ned's death, and we see him as morally justified for fighting the Lannisters, who we view as ruthless, Machiavellian, and lacking the same sense of family. In almost any other story, Robb Stark wins the Game of Thrones, or at the very least exacts vengeance. But in Martin's real world, political ineptitude has severe consequences, as you can argue they do in real life. In The Witcher, we see a similar theme. The series' main character, Geralt of Rivia, exists in a world similar to that of Martin's, that is, a low fantasy, morally ambiguous universe. And that's where a lot of similarities between the works reveal themselves. The irony of both series is that they are fantasy worlds based in realism with plausible depictions of social and political dynamics that you often don't find in high fantasy. So back to Geralt. He's a great character. He exists in a universe that is harsh and cruel. He is unimpressed with the moral foundations of the world around him and maintains his own code of ethics. We love him for his crudeness and cynicism, and yet cannot deny that those traits are typically viewed as flaws of your lead character. It's hard to imagine the noble lead of your story ripping F-bombs. I mean, try to imagine Aragorn saying what Geralt does to the hobbits.
Fuck off, bud.
It would definitely make for a pretty interesting display. Geralt is also an oxymoron in a sense. He is a witcher, a monster hunter trained since childhood, yet often sympathizes with the monsters he's supposed to exterminate. As a result of their mutations, many witchers are seen as social outcasts and perceived as emotionless and dispassionate freaks. The real beauty of The Witcher is its questioning of moral preconceptions. As Geralt hunts monsters, he often comes across humans who are worse than the monsters he's trained to kill. This world is what causes Geralt to be so interesting to us, as we try and perceive it through him, an incredibly powerful social outcast who displays tremendous amounts of empathy and restraint, yet is also crude, threatening, and overly cynical. So to briefly summarize, the styles of Martin and Sapkowski's writing has been called anti-Tolkien, and it's characterized by its reactions to Tolkien's idealism, even though it owes a lot of its success to Tolkien's work. This means that Game of Thrones and the Witcher universes take tremendous inspiration from Tolkien, but lash out and change tune with his idealistic view of medieval life and political structures. I want to add that I love The Lord of the Rings, and I only mean to use it as a reference to distinguish how Martin and Sapkowski break the traditional mold of fantasy writing and storytelling which was created by Tolkien. Another large inspiration behind both of the stories is Norse mythology. If any of you have ever read or are familiar with the subject, Norse mythology is brutally violent, involves a lot of weather-related catastrophe, and has an intense belief in fate and destiny. One of the biggest examples of Norse mythology in Game of Thrones and The Witcher, besides the use of fate, destiny, and prophecy, is something called Fimbulwinter. This prophecy comes from the Norse text, the Poetic Edda, which I read in high school, and it was definitely a tongue twister. The book's actually pretty cool though, and Tolkien gets a lot of the names he uses for the characters in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit from the Poetic Edda, like Gandalf, Thrain, Thorin, Fili, Kili, Fundin, Dwalin, Dori, Nori, and a few more. So in Norse mythology, Fimbulwinter precedes Ragnarok, the final event that destroys the world and wipes out the gods. Ragnarok literally means fate of the gods, and their fate's not good. In the Witcher 3 video game, the White Frost is a phenomenon that leads to the freezing of the entire planet, making it uninhabitable. Even with strong magic and spells, the frost cannot be stopped and at best case can be slowed. It is understood that this is the inevitable end of all worlds. If any of you have ever played the Witcher games, you may remember the quest through time and space, which is where this image comes from. In Game of Thrones, Fimbulwinter is referenced by the idea of the Long Night, where a terrible darkness fell across the known world. And a great winter took place that lasted a generation and laid waste through famine, terror, and the White Walkers, ice spiders, etc. This comes to play in the very first scene of the first episode of Game of Thrones, where White Walkers are seen and kill 2 men of the Night's Watch. The Long Night is referenced throughout the series by the Night's Watch, Melisandre, and several others. The Long Night in Game of Thrones is perhaps the most important event in the entire series, and probably even more important in the books. In Game of Thrones, we see destiny play out with Jon Snow and Daenerys, following the prophecy of the prince who was promised, and in The Witcher, Geralt and Ciri as the Swords of Destiny, along with Geralt and Yennefer in the series as well. We also see themes of cheating death, bastard children, protagonists who don't know their father. We see incest in both series as well. We also see barren women, witches and powerful people getting it on, dragons, sorcery. But ultimately, what really makes the world stand out are their reliance on believable social and political dynamics in a fantasy world. If you got to this point, thank you all so much for watching. I intend to do more videos about Game of Thrones, The Witcher, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and more. If you enjoyed, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.